Hey, what is good, YouTube? This is Who's Like God, and I'm back for my next Leviticus study, where we'll be diving into chapters 5 and 6. And in my opinion, it's going to get easier from here on out. Some of the stuff we've been reading was probably some of the more technical, repetitive stuff within Leviticus, so we're just going to get right in. And it's exciting because these chapters actually have some direct connections to the New Testament. Now, I should recap. In the last chapters, Leviticus 3 and 4, we read about the peace offerings and then sin offerings. One of the main conclusions from that study was to see how in the offerings, fat was prioritized over the skins of the animals. For peace offerings, you would offer the peace offering, but the added layer would be the fat of the animal as a food offering. And verse 16 of Leviticus 3 says, all fat is the Lord. So it just shows how much God prioritized the fat, which ultimately shows us that only the best was supposed to be given to God by the old Hebrew sacrifices, which in a way prefigures Christ. Leviticus 4 goes into the procedures for sin offerings for different groups of people in that society. So with all that being said, we're going to start with Leviticus chapter 5. If anyone sins in that he hears a public adjuration to testify, and though he is a witness, whether he has seen or come to know the matter, yet does not speak, he shall bear his iniquity. Or if anyone touches an unclean thing, whether a carcass of an unclean wild animal, or a carcass of unclean livestock, or a carcass of unclean swarming things, and it is hidden from him, and he has become unclean, and he realizes his guilt, or if he touches human uncleanness, or whatever sort of the uncleanness may be with which one becomes unclean, and it is hidden from him, when he comes to know it and realizes his guilt, or if anyone utters with his lips a rash oath to do evil or to do good, any sort of rash oath that people swear, and it is hidden from him, when he comes to know it, and he realizes his guilt in any of these, and confess the sin he has committed, he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation for the sin that he has committed a female from the flock, a lamb or a goat for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him for his sin. So this section is a little bit, it might seem like a run-on sentence, but it's actually pretty easy to understand. It's basically giving all these different situations where an individual might sin without knowing, and it says, okay, when you come to realize the sin you committed, here's the procedure: offer a female from the flock. And it comes to specifically if you interact with something unclean, which is defined within this part of the law. As we'll get into in future chapters, without realizing, when you come to realize, here are the procedures to atone for that sin. Verse 7, but if he cannot afford a lamb, then he shall bring to the Lord as a compensation for the sin that he has committed 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. Now I want to stop there because it shows that in the law there were provisions for poor people. Here's the procedure: if you sin, if you're not able to afford a lamb, have 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons to sacrifice. Now the reason I want to pause there is because this thing about alternatives to use if you are too poor, we can see in Leviticus 12 and Luke chapter 2. Okay, and so now we're in the New Testament in the book of Luke, San Lucas, and we're reading verse 22. This is what we can read. All right, now when Jesus is young, this is the situation, and when the time came for the purification according to the law of Moses, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who opens first the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. So that's what we just read, and it's getting quoted in the New Testament. And there's another place that talks about the turtles and the pigeons, which is what this is referring to. But the first time it's mentioned is in Leviticus chapter 5. The reason that's important is because it actually shows us that Jesus' family was poor, which is just an interesting thing, because we know the turtle doves, because we know the turtle doves and the pigeons were what you would use if you weren't able to afford a female from the flock. So the fact that in this ritual, Jesus' parents had to use the turtles and the pigeons, from what we just read, the first time they're introduced as an alternative, it actually shows that Jesus' family was not wealthy. He comes from humble beginnings, from a humble, beginning, and then he was a carpenter before he actually began his ministry as the Messiah. So just interesting things that we can study. Leviticus 5 verse 8, he shall bring them, the turtle doves and the pigeons, to the priest. We're back in the Old Testament, who shall offer first the one for the sin offering. He shall wring its head from its neck, but shall not sever it completely, and he shall sprinkle some of the blood of the sin offering on the side of the altar. Well, the rest of the blood shall be drained out at the base of the altar. It is a sin offering. Then he shall offer the second for a burnt offering according to the rule, and the priest shall make atonement for him for the sin that he has committed, and he shall be forgiven. But if he cannot afford 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, then he shall bring as his offering for the sin that he has committed 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour for a sin offering. He shall put no oil on it, and shall put no frankincense on it, for it is a sin offering. And he shall bring it to the priest, and the priest shall take a handful of it as a memorial, its memorial portion, and burn this on the altar, on the Lord's food offerings. It is a sin offering. Thus the priest shall make atonement for him for the sin which he has committed in any one of these things, and he shall be forgiven. And the remainder shall be for the priest, as in the grain offering. So this is cool, because once you study the law and see the different offerings, we can understand when it sort of calls back to one of the other offerings, we could put 2 and 2 together, because in the grain offering, the rest of the grain offering, the priest would eat, and it would be for them. So it's giving the same procedure in this case. So to summarize that, here's, if you sin, here's the procedure. If you can't afford a female from your flock, here are 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons that you could use. We know this is what Jesus' family used for the purification ritual after childbirth. Okay? And if you can't afford turtle doves or the pigeons, then you're using grain. But instead of using it for the grain offering, you're using it for the sin offering. The idea is, even though you're not technically using the right thing or what you're supposed to use, it's sort of a provision for okay, even if you're poor, we're gonna make sure you're able to offer something. But if all you can afford is grain to offer to the Lord, we're not gonna put oil or frankincense on it like we would have in one of the earlier chapters, because it's meant to be a sin offering. If you get my drift, it's basically a way of making sure everyone is able to do this. And if you have to use grain instead of an animal, then it's treated a little bit differently, because it's for a different sin, for a different offering, but all you had was grain to use, if you catch my drift. So it's interesting to see how all these provisions were made so that poor people don't get left in the dust. Laws for guilt offerings, verse 14. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if anyone commits a breach of faith and sins unintentionally in any of the holy things of the Lord, he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation a ram without blemish out of the flock, valued in silver shekels, according to the shekel of the sanctuary, for a guilt offering. He shall also make restitution for what he has done amiss in the holy thing, and shall add 1/5 to it and give it to the priest. And the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering, and he shall be forgiven. So now it's basically the procedures with rams that are valued correctly according to the sanctuary, according to the temple, if you sin unintentionally. What's interesting is a lot of these commandments for the sacrifices are for accidental sins, sinning unintentionally, which you might not expect, but it's what we have here. Okay, so continuing at verse 17. If anyone sins, doing any of the things that by the Lord's commandments ought not to be done, though he did not know it, then realizes his guilt, he shall bear his iniquity. He shall bring to the priest a ram without blemish out of the flock, or its equivalent for a guilt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for him for the mistake that he has made unintentionally, and he shall be forgiven. It is a guilt offering. He has indeed incurred guilt before the Lord. So these offerings are basically, if you do something where you have guilt before the Lord, here are the procedures for offerings so that you could be forgiven. That was Leviticus chapter 5. Basically, to summarize, if the people sin unintentionally, here are the procedures. And God is so good in his wisdom that when he's knowing that there would be poor people, there are different things to offer. If you weren't able to afford, the flock, if you're not able to afford the little birds, then you could use the grain. But it would be treated differently than a grain offering, because it's a different offering entirely, but the Lord is able to use what you have for it to be accepted. Okay, so that's interesting. We're going to finish with Leviticus chapter 6. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if anyone sins and commits a breach of faith against the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposit or security, or through robbery, or if he has oppressed his neighbor or has found something lost and lied about it, swearing falsely, and any of the things that people do and sin thereby, if he has sinned and has realized his guilt and will restore what he took by robbery, or what he got by oppression, or the deposit that was committed to him, or the lost thing that he has found, or anything about which he has sworn falsely, he shall restore in full, and shall add a fifth to it, and give it to him whom it belongs on the day he realizes his guilt. And he shall bring to the priest as his compensation to the Lord a ram without blemish out of the flock, or its equivalent for a guilt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord, and he shall be forgiven for any of the things that one may do and thereby become guilty. Here's the procedures. If you basically mess up your neighbor financially, if you deceive your neighbor in some sort of financial way or economic way, here is the procedure to be forgiven. I also gotta say this, y'all. The fact is, this is the first instance where sinning is explicitly intentional. The next section is cool because it summarizes all the studies we've had so far about all these different types of offerings. Now it's talking about how the priests are going to do each offering. So the next section, which closes out chapter 6, is a summary of everything we've been reading so far, but from the perspective of what the priests are supposed to do for each one. So starting at verse 8 of Leviticus chapter 6, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command Aaron and his sons, those are the high priests, and the priestly lineage, saying, this is the law of the burnt offering. The burnt offering shall be on the hearth of the altar all night until the morning, and the fire of the altar shall be kept burning on it. And the priest shall put on his linen garment, and shall put his linen undergarment on his body, and he shall take up the ashes to which the fire has reduced the burnt offering on the altar, and put them besides the altar. Then he shall take off his garments and put on the other garments, and carry the ashes outside the camp to a clean place. The fire on the altar shall be kept burning on it, it shall not go out. The priest shall burn wood on it every morning, and he shall arrange the burnt offerings on it, and shall burn on it the fat of the peace offerings. Fire shall be kept burning on the altar continually, it shall not go out. Okay, burnt offerings was chapter 1. We're about to see a pattern. Verse 14. This is the law of the grain offering. The sons of Aaron shall offer it before the Lord in front of the altar, and one shall take from it a handful of fine flour of the grain offering, and its oil, and all the frankincense that is on the grain offering, and burn this as its memorial portion on the altar, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. And the rest of it Aaron and his son shall eat. It shall be eaten unleavened in a holy place. In the court of the tent of meeting they shall eat it. It shall not be baked with leaven. I have given it as their portion of my food offerings. It is a thing most holy, like the sin offering and the guilt offering. Every male among the children of Aaron may eat of it, as decreed forever throughout the generations, your generations, from the Lord's food offerings. Whatever touches them shall become holy. Okay, that's rules about the grain offerings. That's chapter 2. The Lord spoke to Moses, verse 19, saying, this is the offering that Aaron and his son shall offer to the Lord on the day when he is anointed. A tenth of an ephah of fine flour as a regular grain offering, half of it in the morning and half in the evening. It shall be made with oil on a griddle. You shall bring it well mixed in baked pieces like a grain offering, and offer it for a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The priest from among Aaron's sons, who is anointed to succeed him, shall offer it to the Lord as decreed forever. The whole of it shall be burned. Every grain offering of a priest shall be wholly burned, it shall not be eaten. So here we're getting something that's a little bit different, but if the priests, the next priest is about to be anointed to step into that role, here's the procedure, and in the grain offering, you actually don't eat the rest of it. Because normally the priest would eat the rest of the grain offering, but in this case where you're anointing your successor of the high priest, you actually don't eat the remainder of it. You burn the whole thing. Verse 24, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and his son, saying, this is the law of the sin offering. Okay, that's chapter 4. In the place where the burnt offering is killed, shall the sin offering be killed before the Lord. It is most holy. The priest who offers it for the sin shall eat it. In a holy place it shall be eaten, in the court of the tent of meeting. Whatever touches its flesh shall be holy, and when any of its blood is splashed on a garment, you shall wash that on which it was splashed in the holy place. And the earthenware vessel in which it is boiled shall be broken. But if it is boiled in a bronze vessel, that shall be scoured and rinsed in water. Every male among the priests may eat of it, it is most holy. But no sin offering shall be eaten from which any blood is brought into the tent of meeting to make atonement in the holy place. It shall be burnt up with fire. Now, this section continues because we didn't cover all of the offerings. So we'll start off in chapter 7, which is actually a continuation of the same passage that the Lord spoke to Moses, okay? But stopping it for right now, we basically get a summary of what we've been reading. All these different types of sacrifices to the Lord. Here is what the priests are supposed to do in the temple service for each one. Okay, so the first couple of verses were about burnt offerings. You know that the temple, the altar is always supposed to be burning. Grain offerings, all the laws for the grain offerings, about how the priests can eat some of the remainder in a holy place, and likewise for all the rest of the offerings. This is basically taking what we've read and applying it to the priest, so that the priests who would actually be in the temple and sanctuary of God would know what to do with their part when all these offerings would happen. All right, so you have the people and the procedures and what you're supposed to do. Here are the commandments for the priests, so that the temple is running day in and day out, day and night, with all these procedures for all these different type of offerings, and what the priests are supposed to do for all these different types of offerings that we've read about. So next time we'll read Leviticus chapter 7 is continuation of the same things. We went chapter 1 summary, chapter 2 summary, then we jumped to chapter 4. So it's a little bit out of order from that perspective, but we're covering all the different offerings that you read about and what the priests are supposed to do in the temple about those. So if you found this helpful, then praise God. Y'all be blessed in the Messiah. I'll see y'all in the next video. Peace.